All right. Welcome to our next alumni speaker presentation from Michael Tuttle, who is in the graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in cognitive psychology. Michael graduated from Eastern in 2020, and we're thrilled to have him back virtually for today's talk. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and just get started. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you folks about what I've been up to. I'll talk in the last 2 years since I graduated. I'll be talking about the research that I've done, and then ending off talking about my experience as a grad student and the sort of tips and advice I've got for undergrads who may be considering grad school in some capacity. So a bit about me. I know Dr. Diller covered some of this. Graduated from Eastern in spring of 2020. I was a double major in both math and psychology. And you'll see how the math plays into my position in graduate school now. At Eastern, I did some psychology research with numerical cognition with Dr. L. I also did, of course, my research methods project. So I had two big research projects during my time at Eastern. And then after that, I moved to UMass Amherst, started a PhD program the fall after I graduated from Eastern. And the title of the program is Cognition and Cognitive Neuroscience. It's cognitive psychology. And my research interests and path have changed pretty significantly from this numerical cognition stuff into studying memory, specifically recognition memory. And I'll be talking about an experiment I did that's about eyewitness memory, which is pretty interesting. And my advisor's name is Jeff Starnes. He's a memory guy, and I'll talk about him more as we get to later parts of the talk. So this is the order that we'll be going in, talking about my research at grad school first. Then I'll give you an idea of what my experience is like as a graduate student, just sort of give you my unique perspective and how things have been treating me. And then I'll go into giving some tips and advice that may be more pertinent to undergraduates at Eastern and those listening to the talk. All right, so first, my research, like I said, it's about eyewitness memory. So I'm going to start sort of by defining some terms for some folks who may be unfamiliar. So let's imagine that someone committed a crime. And let's say it was this woman right here, for the sake of this hypothetical. And this is the person that I'll be calling the culprit. The culprit is the person who actually went out and actually committed the crime. And then after this happens, the police do some investigating, gather some evidence, and they come up with a suspect. The suspect in this hypothetical will be this woman. You'll see it is the same as the culprit, but that's not always the case, right? The suspect may be guilty and therefore be the culprit, but the suspect could also be innocent and be not the culprit. And the goal of the line of procedures is to try and determine whether the suspect is in fact guilty and culprit or is innocent. So what police will do, they get their suspect, they're trying to figure out if this person's guilty or innocent. They will put this person in a lineup. So you'll see I've got my suspect here, and I have 5 other people in the lineup. This is typically the size of the lineup is a total of 6, but there could be more. Again, I've got the suspect here, and the other 5 people are what we will call fillers. They are people that are absolutely guaranteed to be innocent. These 5 people are innocent, but the suspect may be innocent or may be guilty. Again, that's the big idea. And this would be shown to a witness, that is someone who saw the crime happen, and they'll be given a prompt, something like, identify the person you saw commit the crime if you see them in this lineup, otherwise indicate that they are not present. So I've got this red X here, which just sort of indicates the fact that the witness could say, oh, none of these people are the culprit, but the witness could identify the suspect. That's one possible outcome. The witness could identify one of the fillers, second possible outcome, or they could reject the lineup. So there are sort of 3 categories of responses up to this point. Typically and ideally, what would happen next after they make one of those 3 responses is they will indicate their confidence in their response on some scale. This could be a 0 to 100, a 1 to 5, 1 to 10, any kind of scale here. I've just got 4 options here. And they'll just indicate how confident they are that whatever decision they made at this step is in fact correct. So that's just sort of some basic vocabulary. I'm going to move into talking about some of the motivation for my specific project by introducing something called signal detection theory, which is a very useful model. I need to get this off my screen. A very useful model of memory. I'll be showing you how I'm going to be applying it and using it to motivate my research in eyewitness memory. So let's imagine, I'll start by explaining what this x-axis is. Let's say that the witness has some memory of what the culprit looks like. They have some memory of the person they saw commit the crime. This x-axis indicates how well someone else or someone matches that witness's memory of the culprit. So high values mean that someone looks a lot like the way the witness remembers the culprit, and low values would indicate that the person looks nothing like how the witness remembers the culprit. What I've got shown by this normal curve here is the idea that any given innocent person might look a lot like the culprit. Some people will just happen to look a lot like the way the witness remembers the culprit. Some people will look nothing like it, but most people will generally be somewhere in the middle. We can assume that this degree to which someone matches the witness's memory of the culprit is normally distributed. And this idea of like memory match strength, or how well they match, it's sort of an arbitrary scale. So we're just going to center it at 0. We don't really know what that means. We just know that a lot of stuff sort of goes into how well someone could match the witness's memory. So let's assume that people who are innocent, like the fillers or an innocent suspect, would come out of this distribution. Okay, so then I'm going to add a blue curve here to indicate the distribution of memory match strength for someone who's guilty. So you could imagine that generally a guilty person will have a higher match strength than an innocent person, right? Because we're trying to see how well they match the guilty person, right? So generally it'll be a bit higher, which is why this distribution is a bit further to the right. But it's also not going to be exactly one value, right? Sometimes they maybe got a really good look at the guy and he looks exactly the same now in the lineup as he did when they saw him commit the crime. So it's a very high match strength. Or maybe he grew a beard and it's been 5 years and they didn't get a good look at him and it kind of looks nothing like the guy that they saw. But generally it'll be somewhere in the middle. So it follows a sort of normal distribution. So let's assume that, let's say that innocent people will come from this distribution and guilty people will come from this distribution. But then, once you have an idea of how well the people in the lineup might match your memory of the culprit, you need to make a decision. So I'll add a few lines to this plot. And this will give us let's say that the witness has 4 different confidence options like I showed on the previous screen. They could like rate someone 1 to 4. So by adding 3 lines here, we create 4 separate sort of spaces on this plot, right? One all the way to the left, one in between these two, and here. So let's just say, I think this is best indicated with an example, what I mean by this making 4 different decisions. Let's say that I show you one person, you're a witness, you saw some crime, I find a suspect, and I show you the suspect. And they match your memory of the culprit pretty well. I think this is like 1.75. Based on these criteria, because it's all the way to the right here, it's a very good match to your memory of the culprit, you would give them like a high confidence identification because they're a really good match and they exceed your highest criteria line. This would be a high confidence identification all the way up here. If the circle were in between these 2 lines, the resulting response would be a low confidence identification. In these 2, we would expect a low confidence rejection. All the way down here, a high confidence rejection. If the person looks nothing like the guy, be very confident in rejecting the idea that it is the guilty person. Okay, so that's just an example with one person in the lineup. So let's say I also, instead of just showing you one person, show you a bunch of fillers. So now I've got a bunch of fillers here, just with different memory match strengths. I've got the fillers as X's and the suspect as an O. This is just a toy example. I sort of just picked the numbers to fit the example I want to show. But now, the witness, so you can imagine each person in the lineup, matches the witness's memory of the culprit to varying degrees. This filler, who we know is innocent because they're a filler, happens to look quite a lot like the witness's memory of the culprit. This person does not look very much like the way the witness remembers the culprit. And the suspect is a pretty good match as well, who I've got indicated as a circle. I've made the suspect blue to say that, let's say in this example, the suspect was guilty. Okay. Let's assume that when the witness sort of gets these ideas of how well the people in the lineup match their memory of the culprit, they're drawn primarily to the person in the lineup who's the best match, right? Like they'll never pick the second best match in the lineup because there's a better choice there, right? They're only going to pick, if anyone, the person in the lineup who has the highest memory match strength, which would be this person here. So for this lineup, what we would expect the witness to do is identify this filler because, first of all, they are the highest match strength of anyone else in the lineup, and they're to the right of this line, which remember was a high confidence identification. So the result of this toy lineup example is that the witness would pick this filler because they're the best match, and they would pick them with high confidence because they're to the right of the highest criteria line. That's what would happen for this lineup. Okay, so let's do, I'm also completely open to being interrupted at any point if anyone has any questions. Let's do another example. It looks very similar. I'm just going to shift where the suspect is. Let's say the police had a different suspect. All the way down here. So again, the witness would identify who's the highest memory match strength in the lineup. It's, again, this filler all the way up here. He's to the right of the highest criteria, and therefore we would get a high confidence filler identification. Okay, but this example and this example are very critically different, right? In this case, you get a high confidence filler ID, but the suspect is like the witness's second choice, right? Like the suspect is still a really good match to the way that they remember the culprit. Whereas in this case, you would also get a high confidence filler ID, the exact same response. But the suspect is like their last choice. He's a terrible match. They're absolutely certain that the suspect isn't the guy, but you still get the same exact response in this case as in this case. So that seems to be a problem. If I'm an investigator, I want to know if the suspect is like your second choice and still a really good match, or if the suspect is your last choice and you're absolutely certain it's not the suspect. Because I don't really care how much you think the filler is maybe guilty, because I know the filler is absolutely innocent. I want to know where the suspect lies on this, but in a typical procedure, all I get is a filler ID here and a filler ID here. Okay. So this is the question we're going to be trying to address in the research and the procedure that I'm going to be describing. The question, put simply, is can we get more information in those cases where we get a filler ID by also getting a response to the suspect? That is another way of putting that is the same question, is can responses from witnesses who identify a filler, so after they pick a filler, can we get a response to the suspect that gives us some more information about whether the suspect is guilty or innocent? Okay, so I'm going to show an example of a lineup procedure that we tested that aims to get at this, and that might help make this be a bit clearer even. Okay, so let's do another hypothetical crime scenario. Let's say a crime was committed. This time our culprit is this guy here. Again, he's the culprit. That means he is the person who actually committed the crime. In the real world, we do not know who this person is. That's what we're trying to find out. Police do some investigating, and they come up with a suspect. This time you'll notice the suspect is innocent. They did not commit the crime. I just did that in this example to show you that's possible. But here's the suspect, and the police want to figure out if this guy's innocent or guilty. So they put him in a lineup. But this time, we'll do the lineup a bit differently. So the first step looks very similar. I'm calling this lineup procedure an exhaustive simultaneous. You may see why in a bit. But the lineup consists of the suspect from before, 5 fillers, just the same. They've got the option to reject the lineup, and they're told to pick a person if it's the culprit, or reject the lineup if they think the culprit's not present. So it starts off just the same. Let's say the witness picks one of the fillers, say this guy here. They then indicate their confidence. Again, just the same as the last procedure. Let's say it was a 1 to 4 scale. It's definitely not, maybe yes, definitely yes, something like that. What's different about this procedure is after a participant or a witness makes this response, the box jumps to the next person in the lineup and says, okay, I know you picked this guy, he was your #1 choice, but what do you think about the second guy? And again, they can give a 1 to 4 response. And then the box would jump and it would go to the third guy. What do you think about this guy? And then again, same response and so on, you can imagine, to each person in the lineup. Eventually, it also gets to the rejection option, and they can give their confidence that, or how strongly they feel that the culprit may not be present, very similarly. So what's critical about this is that at some point, they have to give this 1 to 4 rating, this response, to the suspect. And you'll notice that 2 of the responses are sort of like rejections, like high confidence rejection, low confidence rejection. And 2 of them are IDs, a low confidence ID and a high confidence ID. So they have to give one of those responses to the suspect, even if they pick a filler at this stage, which otherwise was not the case in the procedure I showed earlier. Okay. So the idea behind this, bringing this back to our signal detection example, is that this case and this case are now different, right? Before I said they would just both be filler identifications, but now this would be a filler ID at that first stage, and when they get to the suspect, they'd give him a high confidence ID because he's also above this line. And in this case, they pick a filler, but when they get to the suspect, they give him a high confidence rejection because he's all the way down here, below this line. So now we've separated apart those 2 cases, and we very much care about that difference because this suspect is more likely to be guilty, and this suspect is very unlikely to be guilty. Okay. So here's that's just sort of all the motivation and the research question, and what we would expect to happen with this new exhaustive lineup procedure. So let's talk about the experiment that actually ran. Participants were shown a study phase, a list of faces that they were told to remember. They were presented one at a time, and they were just told something like, try and remember these faces for the test phase later. So they would be shown one face, another. I think there were 8 faces total, each presented for just a few seconds. Then they would get a test phase, or the lineup procedure, where they were told to choose one of the faces if it was one that they were told to remember, or reject the lineup. And of course, some participants would either get the simultaneous procedure I showed at the beginning, or the exhaustive simultaneous procedure where you rate absolutely everyone in the lineup. Those are the procedures we're going to be comparing. Also, some of the time, there's a 50% chance that the culprit would be present in the lineup, that the suspect would be guilty, or the suspect, in the experiment's case, the suspect was in the study phase, and a 50% chance that the suspect was not in the study phase. And participants didn't know the exact number, but they were told that there's a chance that the people they saw in the study phase would not be in the lineup. And of course, that was also clear because they had the option to reject the lineup. Each participant did 2 lineups, just a study phase lineup and then a study phase lineup. And we had an attention check where participants went through a lineup that had a very obviously incorrect answer, and they had to respond in an appropriate way. Okay. So that was the experiment. Now I'm going to talk a bit about, just sort of really drive home the difference between these procedures and show you how I'm going to analyze the data as a 2-step process. So on the left of this little figure, I've got the simultaneous lineup, step 1 and step 2. On the right, I've got the exhaustive simultaneous lineup, step 1 and step 2. Step 1 of both procedures is exactly identical. They're presented with 6 faces, 1 suspect, 5 fillers. Suspect may be guilty, may be innocent, and they're asked to make a choice. They could pick the suspect, pick a filler, or reject the lineup. So those steps are, step 1 for both procedures is identical. The difference, of course, is in the second step. In the simultaneous, you give your confidence to whoever you picked in step one. If you picked this person in step one, you give me your confidence that she's the culprit. If you picked this person in step one, you give me your confidence that she's the culprit. If you rejected, you give me your confidence that the culprit is not present. In the exhaustive, step two, you give a response to everyone in the lineup individually, right? That red box jumps, and you tell me how likely it is that this guy's the culprit, and this guy, and so on. The part of that I want to zoom in on, and that would be, of course, of most interest to an investigator, is that they will always give a response to the suspect. So here, they give a confidence to the person they picked in step one. Here, they give a confidence response to the suspect specifically, regardless of who they picked in step one. Okay. So this bar plot is only concerned with step one. I'll walk you through what I'm showing here. I'm calling step one the initial selection. On the left, I have the exhaustive simultaneous procedure. On the right, the standard simultaneous. I've further got them broken down into target absent lineups, that is, the suspect is innocent, and target present lineups, that is, the suspect is guilty, for both procedures. And since this is only step one, there are three possible responses. You pick the suspect, you pick a filler, or you reject the lineup, and that's indicated by the colors. There's a few sort of basic things to look at to check that participants are doing the task like well. For example, let's look at the red bars, the suspect picks. They happen more when the suspect is guilty than when they're innocent. That makes sense. They're asked to identify the guilty person if they see them. So this means participants are able to tell the difference between people who are guilty and people who are innocent. That's good. That makes sense. And if we look at the blue bar, the rejections, there are more rejections when the target is absent. There's no guilty person in the lineup. They reject the lineup more, which is the correct response, than when the suspect is guilty, which again makes sense. They're rejecting the lineup more often when they're supposed to than when the target is actually present. So there are some basic trends like that that show us that participants are doing their job correctly. But what's sort of interesting and a good sanity check is I discussed how this step of the process, the initial selection, is identical between the two procedures. If we look between the two procedures, the bars on the left and the bars on the right, they're identical. People are rejecting just as often in target absent simultaneous lineups as in the exhaustive, which again makes sense because at this point they are the exact same procedure. So of course they're doing the same thing in both cases. This just sort of serves as a good sanity check that up to this point, through step one of the procedure, they're identical. But now we get to the interesting part, step two of the procedure, where they actually differ. And just for the sake of time, we'll focus only on filler IDs because they're the one that's relevant to the research question. So what I'm showing you in the bar plot here is the second step, so the confidence response for each of the two procedures, but only for people who picked a filler. So only people who picked a filler in step one, and now I'm showing you their confidence response in step two. So this time, so again, we've got the exhaustive and the simultaneous procedure, target absent and target present lineups. But this time I've got the colors as the 4-point confidence scale. The high confidence rejection, low confidence rejection, low confidence ID, high confidence ID. So what's important here? Well, in the exhaustive, let's start with the exhaustive case. They're giving this confidence response, the rejections or IDs, to the suspect, right? These are people who picked a filler, but these responses are to the suspect. What do we notice? Well, they give a high confidence rejection to the suspect more when they're innocent than when they're guilty. That's good. That means they're giving sort of the correct response more often at least in the rejection case. If we look at the highest confidence ID, this blue, I think, maybe pink bar, colorblind, they give the high confidence ID more to the suspect more when they're guilty than when they're innocent. So what's critical, and same with the second highest confidence ID, the low confidence ID, again, more when they're guilty than when they're innocent. This is about the same across the two. So what's critical here is the difference between their responses when the suspect is innocent and their responses when the suspect is guilty. Because they're different, or the probability of the responses is different, that means that when we get a certain response, we can get evidence about which case it is. Like if the witness says, oh, they give a high confidence rejection to the suspect, we can be more confident it comes from this red bar, the target absent case. We can be more confident the suspect is innocent than that the suspect is guilty because this red bar is shorter. It is more likely that the suspect is innocent after that response than that the suspect is guilty. So its key is the difference between the target absent and target present cases. Okay. Moving to the simultaneous lineup. So this is different. This confidence is to the filler that they picked. Remember, we're only talking about people who picked fillers. But instead of giving a response to the suspect, they give this highly unlikely to highly likely response to the filler that they picked. So someone else in the lineup who is not the suspect. If we try to compare the target absent and target present cases, you'll see the responses are very similar, except for the red bar. The response distributions are very similar. So if you get a filler ID, and then they give that filler a high confidence ID, this bar here, you can't tell, you don't get any additional information about whether it's a target absent case or a target present case, because that's just as likely in both of these cases. Same here and same here. The red bar is a bit of a fluke. There's a very small number of observations in this case. I can talk about it more if people are curious. But I mean, generally, even with that, the vast majority of the time, the response that is given to the filler does not help you distinguish target absent from target present lineups. That's sort of the key takeaway. And that is exactly sort of answering our research question in the first place, that participants who do make a filler identification can still provide useful information for discriminating guilty suspects from innocent ones, right? This response is different when the suspect is innocent than when they're guilty. The distributions are different. So you as an investigator can get more evidence using the exhaustive procedure even after they pick a filler, which is what we expected in that signal detection example I showed at the beginning, that this procedure would help you differentiate those two cases where you pick a filler and the suspect is your second choice, and you pick a filler and the suspect is your last choice. That procedure can differentiate cases like that, whereas the simultaneous procedure, at least this confidence response, cannot do that. So the big takeaway is that you should always get a direct response to the suspect. It's sort of obvious in a way, even if you don't understand the sort of signal detection stuff and even the bar plots. The experiment showed that getting a direct response to the suspect, and no matter what they pick, if they reject the lineup, pick a filler, or pick the suspect, you should always ask them if they think the suspect is guilty or innocent, because that's what you're trying to figure out, is if the suspect is guilty or innocent. So you should always get this direct response to the suspect, because it gives this additional information about whether they're guilty or they're innocent. The other thing I talked about here is that in some cases, in some precincts and in some researchers talk about witnesses who pick fillers as like bad witnesses. Like they picked someone who we know is innocent. That means they're a bad witness. But this research goes to show that we shouldn't throw those people out, because they could still tell us something useful about the suspect, even if they picked a filler. So that's sort of another thing. It sort of goes against that idea that they're bad witnesses or something, because they could still provide useful information about the suspect's guilt or innocence. Okay. So that's it for the research section. If anyone has any questions, I could take them. Other than that, I can move on to talking about grad school in general. Okay.
You can wait till the end if you want.
Okay, that's fine too. I figure since it's a sort of section change that it might make sense to make research questions here, but
That's
I
fine.
sort of keep going. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the second sort of section of the talk, just how my graduate school experience has been, what it's like being a grad student from my perspective, just to sort of give everyone a sample of what it's like maybe to be a graduate student, and to answer some questions that I wish I had asked before I got into all of this. So the first thing, of course, is it was about applying to grad school. The way that I did it was the first thing you have to do is, of course, find a program you want to apply to. I used this site here. I paid $20 for a 3-month subscription. It was maybe the best $20 I've ever spent. This site gives a ton of different psychology programs, master's and PhD programs all across the country, and I think some in Canada too, and wherever the APA accredited programs are. And it gives a ton of information about them. The median years to getting a degree, it shows way more than I've got on this page. The average GRE scores of people who attend, the sort of minimum required or GPA that you should probably have in order to consider yourself as a reasonably good applicant, how many students they admit, how many students they accept or reject, and things like that. I would highly recommend it, but there are other ways to find good programs. You sort of have to do your own research on the internet, but this database was incredibly useful to me personally, and I would highly recommend it if you're having trouble sort of narrowing down the options, because there are a lot out there. Once you sort of have an idea of a program you might fit with, you need to look at people within that program, faculty members. It sort of depends on the area. I don't know exactly how other areas of psychology necessarily work, but I know for my experience, and especially for cognitive and very research focused areas and programs, you will be applying to work with somebody, like as in their lab, and sort of applying to a person. So something you want to do is try and figure out if they're taking new students, if that's something that is available. Some websites, some of the faculty members' websites will say not taking new graduate students for fall 2022, or that they are taking new graduate students. And of course, if they're not taking new students, you should not be applying. But if they are, then you've absolutely got a good shot to take it. That said, that's not always available information, so I'd recommend reaching out to people if at all possible. That is always a good idea to make those connections and to get that additional information about whether they're taking on new students, and to get an idea of what the person studies. But I'll talk more about focusing on your interests in a bit. Next thing I wanted to talk about is a question that I realized pretty quickly I didn't ask anyone before I started grad school, which was sort of what do you do? What does a typical week look like? What are you responsible for as a graduate student? What should I be prepared and know how to do? So I figured I'd walk through sort of what I do in a typical week and what my general responsibilities are, because there are really sort of 3 sections of responsibilities. The first thing I do is I take a few courses every semester. They're mostly reading based, like reading research articles, either really sort of classic influential papers or really new cutting edge research. And they're generally very discussion oriented. Some are more lecture focused than others, but generally it's pretty research and discussion based. The number of courses varies, and like how far you are in the program. People tend to take less courses as they move through their program. I'm in my 2nd year, so I'm still taking like 2 or 3 courses every semester, but that will be less. I'll be less course focused in the future and sort of more research focused, which is another one of the things I'll talk about. But typically in a week, I take 1 to 3 in a semester, a few courses. So I go to class a few times a week for each of these courses. I think both of the ones I'm in right now are an hour and 15 twice a week. So in addition to courses, I also work as a teaching assistant or a research assistant each semester. This is my source of funding. This is how I pay rent and buy groceries and all that good stuff. This is supposed to be about 20 hours a week. And I either teach a section of some course, like a lab section, or there's a lot of grading involved, or you can support the professor in the lecture that they're giving, or something like that. You work as an assistant to some professor. Currently, I am a TA for research methods, so I'm helping students actually run their research. It's a lot of fun, but that's sort of one of my other main responsibilities in addition to taking courses. And the third thing I'm doing is my own research. That's what I spent the whole first half of the talk talking about, designing new experiments, programming up experiments, doing data collection, data analysis, trying to get a good understanding for future projects, and meeting with my lab, my advisor. Every week I have 1 to 2 meetings with my advisor to talk about what I've been up to, what I should be doing next, what my priorities are in order to further my research and get closer to things like my master's thesis, my degree, and in the future, the requirements that I need for my PhD. So those sort of 3 things, coursework, assistantship work, and research, are the things that I'm generally juggling throughout each semester. Oh, and I have something that was different from undergrad, at least the way I was an undergrad, is that I have a fairly typical workday schedule as a graduate student. People expect me to generally work during like work hours and not necessarily be responsible outside of that. So each and every day I try to go in, we have an office, and I go in around 9, get out around 5, and sort of work as an adult. Okay. The other thing that I've been very grateful for in graduate school is the various opportunities I've had to practice presenting my research. Um, One thing I did this year, and I actually did as an undergrad, thanks to Dr. L, was present at Psychonomics, which is the biggest cognitive psychology conference. This year was virtual, which was unfortunate, but I did get the chance to speak one-on-one for like 15 minutes with like the eyewitness guy, a big celebrity, John Wickstead, who does a ton of eyewitness research and a lot of other memory research. So he came by, talked to my poster. He really liked it. It was great. It was a really valuable experience to sort of get my name out there and get my face out there and talk to all kinds of folks. And it was really fun. Actually, it was nerve-wracking going into it, but it went exceptionally well. It was very exciting. And to the right, you can see this is the poster that I submitted and presented at Psychonomics. I also think I'll be presenting again this year on some new research. Another thing that we do, at least in the department that at UMass Amherst, is that once per year I'll present my research that I've been up to the department, to the cognitive psychology area. So all the faculty members and other graduate students will come, and I'll talk for an hour about all of the research I've been up to basically for the past year. And it sounds very scary, and I think for some students it is, but the environment that I've been in at UMass Amherst is very helpful and very nurturing and valuable. And the people there ask a lot of good questions, a lot of helpful questions. No one's trying to trick you or make you look dumb. It's incredibly helpful for understanding your research better, because when you try and teach someone about it and they ask unique questions with unique perspective, you get a better idea about the stuff you're talking about. But you also get new ideas and new research questions and things to look at and talk about, and just a lot of practice for sort of higher stakes presentations. So those sort of presentation experiences have been incredibly helpful for me at both alleviating stress and I think making me a better presenter. Okay, so on to the third and final section of my talk, which I'll be talking about my tips and advice for undergraduates that are considering graduate school in some way. The first thing I want to talk about is figuring out what you're interested in and figuring out if you want to go to graduate school. I mean, it's not an option that's necessarily for everyone. I'm very grateful that I did. I think it was absolutely the way for me to go. But you should be talking to faculty members that know you well, and talking to students who are in grad school about their experiences and how well they think you may fit the mold for someone who may enjoy some sort of grad school or further education. And if you do decide to do that, finding interests in the research that you really care about and that you are passionate in some way or want to do, it's always a lot better, and you're more likely to be accepted to a lab if you show interest in what they're doing. And if you are interested in what they're doing, you're always going to have a much better time. Some ways you could do that is this is something that I sort of didn't even think to do for some of the people I applied to, is look at the studies they've already published. That's a very useful way to just figure out the sorts of things that they're interested in, the methods they use, the analysis types of things that they do, and the general arguments that they make in their research is by looking at the studies of the people that you're applying to work with and see what they've published. And what they've been working on. It's a very valuable way to get more information than just the single paragraph on their website, which only tells you so much and is sometimes really outdated or impossible to find. Some of the websites for some of these huge schools are absolutely terrible and unusable, but looking at the work they've actually put out will give you the best idea of what they're up to and allow you to see if you're a good match for working with them. That's sort of what I said, visiting the website, also very useful. And I would recommend on some occasions reaching out and making some connection, contacting them if you want more information, because again, like I said, the websites can be very difficult to work with. Okay, preparing for grad school, making yourself like a really good candidate involves developing key skills. One of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing is programming experiments. Again, this is maybe not necessarily the case in all areas of psychology or even in all cognitive departments, but the most valuable skill that I have developed is the ability to code and code experiments. So how to make sure participants are seeing the correct stimuli, and I've run all my experiments online too. So being able to get those stimuli and those correct conditions and presentations and all kinds of complicated things to people on their home computer screens via like Amazon Mechanical Turk is an incredibly useful skill for the modern era and in any sort of research. Being able to do it online for research that can be done in that way is incredibly useful and really spearheads things. So that was an important skill. And data analysis, this is also sort of coding related, at least for R, which is what I use to run all my data, and I learned about it in undergrad. There are courses at Eastern that use R, so having some familiarity with that is very useful. Python's another one I don't actually use much. SPSS, of course, for some stats analysis, also very useful. So there are plenty of other things as well, as just the few that I've been familiarized with. But it depends on the place you're applying for. Typically, when you apply to a program, before they officially accept you, they'll invite you to visit in some way. And one of the questions that I found myself asking repeatedly is, what sort of data analysis tools do people typically use, around here? And how do they tend to run their experiments or get their experiments out there? And I got a lot of responses of things like Python or R. And when I heard people say R, I knew, oh, I have a lot of experience with that. Maybe I'll be a good fit for this area and working with these people, which is part of the reason I ended up at UMass. Is they're very R heavy and very proficient in that way, and they found that, in fact, I already knew a lot of that as an incredibly valuable skill. So sort of knowing what people are already using in the lab specifically or in the program that you're applying for is incredibly useful, and that's a question I'd recommend asking if you go to interview. Similarly, identifying your strengths is especially for the application process. You really want to be able to play up whatever strengths and experiences you have, especially in research. I mean, that's really the biggest thing when it comes to graduate school. Your grades are important too, and GRE scores and things like that. But experience with research, presentation, conferences, which are all things that I was set up well with from Eastern. I think I had a few conference presentations and a few research projects. Very valuable, and people will put a lot of stake in that. Also, experience teaching or research assistantships are also very, very nice. I had a few teaching assistantships during my time at Eastern, and that also helped me be a better teaching assistant now as a grad student. A lot more comfortable teaching undergrads. Any awards and scholarships, and then I sort of have this idea that these are really the things you should try and focus on when you're building an application. Anything that sets you apart from other applicants in your area. And then I've got what I think is the most important piece of advice that I was given as an undergrad, but I almost didn't take even as seriously as I should have. is knowing your advisor. This is the most important thing I think I could recommend to anyone thinking about graduate school, is that the person that you're working with and the people that you're surrounded with can really make or break your grad school experience. I know folks who are working with advisors that don't respond to emails for weeks and just sort of offer them no guidance and no patience, and unclear expectations is a very difficult thing to work with. And I've been incredibly blessed at UMass that the people I work with are very responsive. I meet with my advisor like 2 or 3 times per week, and his office door is always open, and they answer questions and make it clear what their expectations are, which is a really important thing. I sort of always have a clear to-do list of where to go next and what's coming up on the horizon, and I never feel lost or alone when it comes to doing a lot of this grad school stuff. And that's really the most important thing, is having an advisor, since you're going to be working so closely with them, that is very willing and able to help you through a lot of these things. And when you go to interview is when you can figure out these things. You should talk not only, of course, to the person you're going to be working with and sort of get a feel for how they are, but also to the other students in their lab. If they have any current graduate students, try and ask them what it's like working with them. Ask them how often they meet, how clear expectations are, what sort of things they expect from you, and what your responsibilities are working for them. And getting those ideas and that feedback can really help you make your decision on whether or not you want to commit to a certain program. I was accepted into 2 of the, I think, 6 or 7 programs I applied to, and the way I narrowed down the decision between the 2 was that at UMass I really enjoyed the people that I spoke with, that I interviewed with all the different cognitive faculty, and they were really kind, and they talked to me like I was on their level, and very casually. It was very nice, a very sort of friendly and relaxed environment. And the other university I went to, I will not necessarily name, the person who I was intending to work with was kind of mean, and I didn't really like the way that he talked about other students and other graduate students of his. And it was that reason that I decided not to work with him. And I'm incredibly grateful that I based my decision on that, because regardless of what you're doing and what you're studying, if you don't have the right support structure, it's going to be infinitely more difficult. So again, this is the most important piece of advice. I would strongly recommend trying to get an idea of the person you will be working with and the sort of people and support structure surrounding them. Thank you. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. I put my email there. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. The research was really interesting, and the guidance for contemporary students on grad school, I think, will be really helpful. I'll go ahead and stop recording now so that we can take questions off record. And thank you so much.
Of course.